All right. So we are in the middle of this somewhat esoteric topic. And the topic started with the Mishnah on 8a2. The difference between a person who has gonorrheal emissions and sees 2 emissions versus a person who sees 3 emissions. If a person has this, it's called a zav. Zav means oozing. And if he has this oozing, then if he sees them, then he's ritually impure, and it's a very specific and serious kind of ritual impurity. And if he sees 2 times, he's ritually impure. The 3rd time, the Mishnah says he's the same. There's no difference between the 2 times and the 3 times, except that once he has a 3rd time, not only is he ritually impure, but to become pure, and we looked at this last time. Not only does he have to count clean days where he doesn't have this oozing anymore, it stops, and then he has to go to the mikveh. But besides that, he also has to bring a sacrifice, a korban, to complete his process of becoming ritually pure. Just a note that we think about sacrifices mostly as sin offerings, to propitiate God when we do something bad. And of course, that's only one tiny little piece of the sacrificial system. We've noticed this all the time whenever we actually get into those Torah readings. Mostly what we have in the Torah is sacrifices of thanksgiving. We have that from Noah. We have it from Cain and Abel, unfortunately. We have it in other situations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They offer sacrifices to mark a sacred experience, an experience of the sacred that they have, and are in awe of it and are grateful for it. So sacrifices have a lot more going for them than simply trying to propitiate the Old Testament God, so to speak. But here is a different function, which is not as perhaps as obvious for us, and that is that the sacrifice is also a kind of a cleansing vehicle. That by giving the sacrifice, it's related to atonement, but it's not about atonement. It's about reinstating oneself in the presence of God, because a person who is ritually impure cannot come into the temple. So the sacrifice marks the fact that I'm coming in again. It's an act that shows that this act is possible for me, because it shows that I am again able to go into the temple. So the sacrifice is its own proof and its own effecting of ritual purity for the person who's bringing the sacrifice. All right. So now we started reading the Gemara, and what we had in our Gemara is questions about what are the scriptural bases for these rules that we make a distinction about the 2 seeings versus the 3 seeings. And we saw that they're reading the verses and almost like counting the words. It's not so much that they're reading the verse for the simple meaning of the verse, but rather they see that the word zav, zovo, his flow, his emission, is it mentioned more than once? Why did it need to be mentioned? We already know that that's the topic. If it's mentioned more than once, it means that we see the emission more than once. This gives us the idea of how many sightings or how many emissions there are, 1, 2, 3. And therefore, when we get to the context, we've counted up 2 when the Torah says that a person who has these emissions is ritually impure. And then we count up 3 mentions of emissions when it says that the Torah says he should have a sacrifice. And then we go back and forth saying it's a little arbitrary. maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's this way, maybe it's that way. And then we start putting in simple kinds of logic. It doesn't make sense to read the verses the way you're suggesting, because 3 includes 2. So if you're going to say 2 is when he has a sacrifice, but 3 he doesn't have a sacrifice, that makes no sense, because once he has 2, he's already chayav, he's already obligated to bring the sacrifice. The third one shouldn't erase the obligation to bring a sacrifice. So that's where the Torah, the Gemara says, the reading that we have and the way that we put up, the way that we infer these rules is the best reading that we can have. Okay, so let's start. I think we sort of went to 8a3. I would say, how about the first full paragraph? The Gemara observes. Is that possible? Bill, you usually put a little marker. David, yeah.
There's no issue here of kamle midarabamine because there's a passage of time. He's really chayav for one, and then another one happens and he's chayav for another. It's not a simultaneous.
The opposite. Whenever there is no such thing as kimle midarabamine. When it's not simultaneous. It's only when it is simultaneous.
Right.
So the fact that this is not simultaneous means that you can be obligated in a million things.
So
each thing is separate. Number 2, the sacrifice is not more strict or less strict a punishment than going to the mikveh. It's a different obligation, and it's not a punishment. Kim Levi Drabane is all about punishment. So none of that actually applies here. Number 3, when the Torah tells you that you have to do A and B, then we don't come along and say, Kim Levi Drabine. So, but we put that very, very complex issue. The word issue, of course, is also very appropriate for a zav. But we put that aside when we got out of that other Mishnah. So, okay, back to here. But Bill, do you have a marker where we stopped?
I do not, Rabbi. It was one of the first times that I did not do that. I have the feeling that we stopped at the bottom of the left-hand column on A3, where it says the Gemara answers, but I'm not sure about that.
All right. So you know what we're going to do? If people don't object, we're going to then start sort of at the top of the left-hand column. Okay. In other words, I'm going to read to you from the previous page. The Gemara says, "Mina hanemili." How do we know these things? Where are these laws derived from Scripture? So I sort of reviewed it, but we'll do it one more time fast. Now, 8A3, top of the page, left-hand column. Who's going to read?
I will.
Thank you.
For the rabbis taught in the Baraita, Rabbi Simai says, the verse has enumerated 2 emissions and called him Tameh, and has enumerated 3 emissions and called him Tameh. How is this to be explained? If a Zav is Tameh after even 2 emissions, why must Scripture also state that he is Tameh after 3 emissions? This teaches that 2 emissions bring him to the stringent Tuma of a Zav, and 3 emissions bring him to the obligation of an offering upon his purification.
Okay, so this is what our Mishnah then is based on, according to the Gemara, right? This reading of the way that the Torah puts out the status of the Zav, and then the obligation that he has to bring a korban, to bring a sacrifice. Okay, now, question, here we go.
The Gemara questions this resolution of this verse by considering an alternative, and say rather that 2 emissions bring him to the stringent Tumah of a Zav, and do not bring him to the obligation of an offering upon his purification, whereas 3 emissions bring him to the obligation of an offering, but not to the stringent Tumah of a Zav. How do we know that a Zav of 3 emissions is subject to both stringencies?
Right, so the Gemara is asking, how do we know that these 2 things combine? It's actually a little bit it's not the right uses of the phrase, but David's point about Kimle Bidrabine How do we know that we apply both? Maybe we only apply one. Maybe for 2 emissions, we consider this a case of ritual impurity. And with 3 emissions, we consider this a case where a person is obligated for a sacrifice, but there is no ritual impurity. No ritual impurity, no sacrifice for 2. Sacrifice, but no ritual impurity for 3. So go ahead. Gemara says,
the Gemara rejects this alternative. Say in rejection of this alternative, before he experienced 3 emissions, he experienced 2 emissions. He already assumed the stringent tumah with the 2nd emission, and there is no reason that tumah should be suspended when he experiences the 3rd.
Right. Once you're tamei, unless you do something about it, you're going to stay tamei. Right? This is our situation in today's world. All of us are presumed to be completely tamei, ritually impure, because one way or the other, we have come in contact with a corpse or with people who have come in contact with a corpse. And none of us have been able to get ritually cleansed with the red heifer ashes, because we don't have that anymore. So we are all tamei and will be tamei until the Mashiach comes, right? And that's the way it goes. Okay.
Still, the Gemara asks, but say rather that 2 emissions bring him to the obligation of an offering and not to the stringent tumah of a zav, whereas 3 emissions bring him even to the stringent tumah of a zav. Perhaps the feature shared by a zav of 2 emissions and a zav of 3 is the requirement of an offering, and the additional feature of a zav of 3 emissions is the degree of his tumah.
Okay, so how do we know that maybe we can actually push off? This is such a severe kind of ritual impurity. Maybe we should only have that when it comes to 3. 3 strikes and you're out. And maybe with 2, then a korban is good enough, but maybe you're not going to be so tamei. But with 3, you'll have the tumah and you'll have also the sacrifice. So, okay.
The Gemara answers, this possibility should not enter your mind, for it was taught in a baraita. The verse states, and the Kohen shall provide him atonement before God from his emission.
Mi zovo.
The prefix from mi implies a limitation.
So let's stop that for a second. This is not an obvious point. This is a midrashic specialized point that in general, when we read these kinds of things, for instance here, he's going to get a cleansing from his impurity. So that makes perfect sense. We take you away from your impurity and we make you pure. But very, very often when the rabbis read the word from, they read it as there's some kind of impurity that's not involved here, right? It's mizovo means of this impurity, but not all impurities. It doesn't apply all cases. It applies only sometimes. So what's the limitation? Namely,
the prefix from implies a limitation. Namely, some zavin bring an offering and some zavin do not bring an offering. How so? If he experienced 3 emissions, he brings an offering. If only 2 emissions, he does not bring an offering.
Okay, so therefore, one second. So what they're saying is that he will be cleansed from his emission is not the way we usually read it, directly taking away the emission, but from this emission, but not a different emission. Is it another emission that will be, that he won't be cleansed in this way, but he'll be cleansed in another way. How do we therefore do it? With 2 emissions, he does not bring an offering, right? That's what we say, right? Okay. Oh, but now the Gemara says, wait, maybe we can go the other way. Go ahead.
Or perhaps not so. Rather, if he experiences 2 emissions, he brings an offering. If he experiences 3 emissions, he does not bring an offering. Say in rejection of this alternative, before he experienced 3 emissions, he experienced 2 emissions. He already assumed the obligation to bring an offering with the 2nd emission, and there is no reason for the obligation to fall away when he experiences a 3rd.
Right. So the word assumes an obligation is not such a great line. It's not a personal choice. He becomes obligated to bring the korban. And this again, in similar fashion, once you are obligated to do something, you don't stop being obligated to do it. Just, it doesn't get forgotten about. So if you were obligated for two, then then experiencing a third one is not going to take that obligation away. Obligations stay. That's the approach that the rabbis have for everything, right? Once we're obligated to do a certain commandment, to do a certain mitzvah, then we're obligated until such time as we fulfill that obligation, right? Okay. Okay, now the Gemara observes.
The Gemara observes, the exposition of Rabbi Simai is necessary, and the Baraita's exposition from the expression from his emission is necessary. They are complementary and both essential to the derivation. For if from the exposition of Rabbi Simai alone, who proves from scripture a distinction between a zav of 2 emissions and a zav of 3, I could have said a rebuttal like our question posed in the Gemara above to Rabbi Simai's proof, namely that perhaps the distinction between a zav of 2 emissions and a zav of 3 is the degree of tumah, not the requirement of an offering. Therefore, the limited expression from me, his emission, written in regard to a zav's offering, informs us that the distinction between the two is in regard to offerings. And if a proof were to be brought from the limited expression from his emission alone, I would not know how many emissions are meant by that verse. Therefore, Rabbi Simai's exposition informs us that scripture distinguishes between a zav having 2 emissions and a zav having 3.
Okay, so the fact that we have this, what's the difference? Rabbi Simai is counting the number of times that the word zovo is mentioned. The other approach says, well, we just have this extra letter, mi zovo, that gives us the clue that we have to make distinctions. What Rabbi Simai says is we have to make distinctions because we've got the mention of ritual impurity after we count 2 times that the word zovo happens. And then we have the mention of a sacrifice when we have 3 times mentioning zovo. The other Braita says, let's just cut to the chase. When we get to the sacrifice, it says that the sacrifice is obligatory mi zovo, only in some cases of zovo. So therefore, we make a distinction between 2 and 3. And of course, we have the whole thing. You can't do it with 2 and not 3 and 3, and which way you make the distinction is logic. But the Gemara now says, if according to that way of looking at it, we don't need to count zovos. We don't need to count 1, 2, 3. We could just have mi zovo. The answer is we need Rabbi Simai because otherwise we wouldn't know when the stringency of zav actually kicks in. Does the stringency of zav kick in after 1 experience, 2 experiences, or 3 experiences? So therefore, Rabbi Simai gives us the handy way of seeing, one issue of flow does not yet render a person a zav. You need 2 zovos to make a person a zav. And then for a sacrifice, the 3rd. Okay, good. Okay, so now the Gemara asks.
The Gemara asks, and now that you have said that the expression from me, his emission, is to be expounded as a limitation to teach a law, what law do you expound from the verse, and when the zav is cleansed from his emission? The Gemara replies, that word appearing in that verse is needed for what was taught in a Baraita, which expounds that verse at length. And when the zav is cleansed...
Just to make clear the distinction, when we look at the verse on the previous paragraph, the previous column, that is atonement, v'chiper, right? Here it's yithar. Here it's cleansing, just plain ritual purity, to become tahor. So we did the other one with that verse about the Kohen. What about now this one, which talks in passive about the zav himself, will become ritually purified? What do we do there? There also it says mizovo, from his emissions. So, which of course is no question if you just take this as plain Hebrew, but they are making this into a very artificial reading. Go ahead.
The Gemara replies, that word appearing in that verse is needed for what was taught in a Baraita, which expounds that verse at length. And when the Zav is cleansed, this means when he ceases from his emission, immediately he begins counting the 7 clean days. From his emission, this teaches, and not from his emission and his sara'at affliction. That is, if the Zav was also afflicted with sara'at, he may count his 7 days free of emission, even while he is still a metzorah. From his emission, he shall count. This teaches about a Zav who experiences only 2 emissions and is thus being cleansed from his emission. That is, from a limited condition of Zav. That he requires a counting of 7 clean days before immersion.
7 clean days, right. I think you said 17. Go ahead. Before his emission. Okay.
The Baraita, however,
Stop. We're going to get to the Baraita in a second. So let's understand now what's going on. The Gemara says we have a lot of other details that we need to root in scripture. So I mentioned before, these are kind of arbitrary ways of reading in the sense that they don't follow from strict contextual, simple ways of reading Hebrew. What the Gemara is doing is the phrase that we had, the term that we had earlier in Pirkei Avot, midrash, seeking, right? Seeking out ways to take laws that are assumed and find a way to tie them back into the Torah. We have Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law. The oral law gives us a variety, zillions of laws that give us detailed instruction about all kinds of situations. If we look at the Torah itself, the Torah does not. I mean, the Torah's got plenty in it, but the Torah does not go through the minutiae of all kinds of things. The most famous example is, for instance, how do you keep Shabbos? It's in the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments says, keep Shabbos. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, right? Don't violate the Shabbos by doing any manner of work. Okay, thank you. Now, please explain to me, what does that mean? And of course, the Torah never explains. The Torah does not tell us what it means to keep Shabbos, what it means to violate Shabbos. All of the details, the guidelines are supplied by the oral Torah, by the interpretations that accumulated over time with people thinking about it, studying it, struggling with it, experimenting with it, arguing over it. So we have the same thing with ritual impurity and purity. These are ancient concepts. We didn't invent them. They're out there in many other cultures as well. But how do you handle it? And how do you, distinguish situations that are more serious than others, or that how do you make sure that you're actually doing it right? If you take this stuff seriously, which honestly speaking, we don't, but they did. If you take it seriously, this is, very consequential. What is going to make me ritually pure after I contract this status of ritual impurity? What happens if I have more than one situation that has applied to me? So that's what we have here in our Gemara now. What happens if I become ritually impure from 2 different circumstances? One circumstance is that I had this gonorrheal emission. The other circumstance is I also have this skin affliction. Both of them are mentioned in the Torah as rendering me ritually impure. Does it end up being the same ritual impurity? It doesn't matter whether I got it from A or from B. If I'm in a car accident, it doesn't matter whether a car hit me or a truck hit me. Or no, if I get hit by this, that's one kind of ritual impurity. If I get hit by the other thing, it's another kind of ritual impurity. And each one has to be taken care of on its own. So that's what we have here. And for instance, just again, to put it into contemporary practice, in the traditional community, menstrual impurity is still taken seriously, right? In the Orthodox community, if a woman becomes a menstruant, she is rendered ritually impure, and she will stay ritually impure until such time as she goes to the mikveh. So she has to take away that ritual impurity and immerse herself in a mikveh. When she immerses herself in a mikveh, she becomes ritually pure, washing away the ritual impurity of nida. But what I mentioned before, the fact that we're all ritually impure because we've come in contact with death, that stays. The mikveh can't wash that away. So we have two very different statuses. Stati, does anybody ever say stati?
No, statuses.
No, why not? How come? You're a classical scholar.
To confuse the enemy.
Yeah. So we have two ritual impurity statuses, one of which is washed away, literally, and one of which stays, and there's no contradiction. We don't say, well, since you're still ritually impure for this serious ritual impurity, then forget about ever getting rid of anything else. No, you get rid of one, even though you can't get rid of the other. So now the Gemara is saying is the same thing happens with these two situations. You're a zav and you're a metzora. You're a person who is afflicted with tzara. 1 second, Sylvia. So you can count the 7 clean days and be cleansed. You go to the mikveh. You've seen two issuings, two emissions of gonorrheal flow. That makes you ritually impure as a zav. You also happen to be biding your time because you're ritually impure as a metzora, as a quote unquote leper. We're not, we're using that term incorrectly. So the Gemara says you might think that your cause is lost until you can get rid of that leper thing. You'll never be able to get rid of the other one. No, that's mizovo. You can be ritually cleansed from one ritual impurity, even though you're still stuck with the other ritual impurity. Yeah, Sylvia.
What about disease in general, not just gonorrheal disease? How is that treated?
Disease is halachically irrelevant to your status as a human being. It's pain and suffering is one of the realities of life. We pray for healing. It's a mitzvah to go to a doctor. It's a mitzvah for the doctor to heal you. This is just the plain old terribleness of our vulnerability as human beings, as material, fleshly creatures. Being sick has no ramifications halachically for anything. You can have a seder when you're sick. If you're too sick to have a seder, that's a different story. If you're too sick to do things, then you're considered onus. You're considered to be, it's not under your control. God only asks you to do the things that you can do. But a sick person can daven. A sick person can be the shliach tzibur for the community. A sick person can give tzedakah. A sick person can't eat treif unless it's a life-threatening situation, and the treif food will save his life. So in that sense, the ultimate sickness of death overrules all of those things. But in general, sickness is just part of the terrible, side of life, and has no downsides with regard to ritual law. Yeah.
But, gonorrhea is a disease also.
So that's the thing. So I'm using these terms for whatever they're worth, but that's where the Torah singles out certain things and not other things, right? I mean, leprosy is a disease. Hansen's disease is a disease. And yet the tzara'at that the Torah singles out as this skin affliction that makes you ritually impure is not Hansen's disease. That we know. It's no identifiable disease that we can think of. But again, God forbid any of the diseases that we know of, COVID, the flu, chicken pox, all of those things, none of them have a consequence in terms of changing your status as a Jew or as a human being. God forbid, the big C. It's terrible. We all pray for each other, but it doesn't change your status as a Jew or as a person.
Do you think it has to do with the sexuality of the seminal emissions?
Well, that goes back to your question then. So why not gonorrhea? Why not? And what about this? And what about that? It certainly is rooted in the genitalia situation, right? It's about some kind of reproductive, issue, so to speak, pun intended. It has something to do with life and death. That's in general the best understanding we have of ritual purity and impurity altogether. And ritual impurity is a ritualized recognition of some kind of serious impingement of mortality into your life. And we didn't go beyond that. If we were writing the Torah today, would we say, you know what, every cancer sufferer is ritually impure? Would we say that? I don't know. But we didn't, we're inheriting something from thousands of years ago, and we're, from my perspective, happy enough to keep it as limited as possible. That being said, I think that there's great value in using some of the rituals that we have in a more emotionally therapeutic way. So I've had the meaningful experience of taking somebody who did recover, thank God, from cancer, and who said, I want to go to the mikveh. I want to go to the mikveh to feel somehow that my life has been given back to me. And we made an appointment and we went to the mikveh. So in Boston, there is a mikveh that is so much more open to these kinds of ideas. It's called, what's it called? Mayim Chaim, maybe. It was founded by Anita Diamond of the Red Tent fame, the woman who wrote that novel. She's a feminist. She's a very good writer. She's a person that I recommend her books when I counsel people who are getting married or people who have a child or looking forward to having a child. She wrote really, really good books that are full of wisdom and sensitivity and, bringing the tradition, but also bringing new ideas. She created a mikveh that, unfortunately, in most other places, the mikveh is an institution that's under lock and key by the Orthodox community. She created a mikveh that's open to the public and that uses the life-enhancing experience of immersing yourself in natural waters. She's used it as a vehicle to allow people to find many, many ways to renew themselves. So she's given a tremendous gift to the Jewish community, and it's good. It's good. Yeah.
There's sort of an additional logic to the menstruation situation in the mikveh, because by the post mikveh is probably a period of fertility for the woman.
Right. So people have noticed that, and that's where the ritual impurity part uniquely is involved also in the sexual relations issue between the woman and the man, right? That in all other situations, there's people who are ritually impure can have sexual relations with each other, but with a nidah, with a woman who has menstruated, until the woman is ritually purified, there is a prohibition to have sexual relations with her. So people have flipped it around and said what you say. This is the Torah's fertility system, right? To maximize the chances that people will be eager to be together with each other because there's this enforced period of separation, and voila, the Torah times it so that for most people it works out that when they get back together, it maximizes the chances of having a child. And of course, this actually becomes a whole very complicated story that we're not going to get into, where for some women, it doesn't work that way. And then you have some interesting questions that are brought to rabbis. What happens if my fertility cycle is not at that point, but is actually prior to that point? Then what? So not going into that. Yes, Josie.
There was actually a situation in my old neighborhood where a very sincere Catholic couple was having a lot of trouble conceiving, and they asked to be recommended to a rabbi to explain, to explain the Jewish laws of the mikveh, because the Jewish families they knew had a lot of children and they had a baby, and they always told that story.
Look at
went
that.
to the rabbis.
Right, and they named the baby Shmerel, right?
I don't know what I can't remember.
Very good. See that? Yeah, very cool. All right, so let's get back to here. So what the Gemara is now saying is that we have these extra verses that specifically are limited to ritual impurity to tell us that there's a distinction between one ritual impurity status and another, and we can get rid of one even though the other one will stay, right? So he counts the 7 clean days. That's an important part of this system also. Even though with regard to the Zav, there's no fertility issue involved. The counting the 7 clean days with regard to a woman who's a menstruant folds into the fertility cycle of many women, but the 7 clean days that we have here have nothing to do with fertility itself. They're simply the magic number 7 that we always have in the Torah. And if you count those days, and then you go to the mikveh, you will be ritually pure with regard to your Zav status, even though your Tzarat status will still be continuing. Okay? Good. Yes? All right. 8a4. The Braita, however.
The Braita, however, questions the need for a scriptural source to teach that a Zav of only 2 emissions requires 7 clean days. But can it not be logically derived in the following way? If he is considered a complete Zav in that he conveys Tumah to his couch and seat, as derived by Rabbi Simai above, should he not also require counting 7 clean days?
Okay, let's look, for instance, at 38, the note.
Note 38. That is, once we know that a Zav of 2 emissions assumes all the stringencies of Zav Tumah, as derived by Rabbi Simai above, what source is there to limit the requirement of 7 clean days to a Zav of 3 emissions, according to Rashi? Barring such a source, even a Zav of only 2 emissions is naturally included in this requirement.
The Gemara is sort of asking is, why should we tie the counting of 7 days to the obligation of bringing a sacrifice? It's clearly in other situations related to the idea of getting yourself out of a situation of ritual impurity. Once we've established that ritual impurity of a Zav kicks in with 2 episodes, then of course that's that very serious kind of ritual impurity, more serious than other ritual impurities, because it conveys ritual impurity to other things and in different kinds of situations that don't apply to others. Clearly, the counting the 7 days should be related to that status and not to the obligation to bring the sacrifice. Before we go into that question, but you know what? We're not gonna let's just do it. Go ahead. We'll go. Let's just stick on topic. I'm not going to digress. Go ahead. 8b1. No, you're on mute.
Now, sorry.
Good.
The Baraita replies that the requirement for a Zav of 2 emissions to count 7 clean days could not be logically derived from the stringency of his Tumah, because the case of the woman who watches a day corresponding to a day demonstrates that the 2 laws are not interdependent.
So let's look at number 1. Let's look at note number 1. What's the Shomeret Yom Keneged Yom?
Yep. Note number one. There is an 11-day span between a woman's menstrual periods during which a discharge of uterine blood renders her a zava. And there are various references for how the days are calculated. If during those 11 days...
Let's just stop for a second just to understand.
Yep.
There is a zav situation, that's for a male, and then there's a zava, that's feminine for a zav. So the word zav means oozes, a person who's oozing. So in the case of the male, we've defined the oozing as some kind of oozing that is not a seminal emission, but it's some other kind of oozing. So I called it a gonorrheal emission. With regard to a woman, the woman is also possibly susceptible to becoming a zava, an oozer, right? Someone who oozes, and in the feminine, zava. But there, the question is, what is the oozing? And it turns out that it's blood in the wrong time, so to speak, right? In other words, I've got my usual cycle. So if I calculate from last year, so this from last month, I should be finished with my cycle on January 1st. Okay, so starting on January 1st, I'll finish bleeding, and then I'll start counting. I'll check myself each day. I'm not bleeding. I count my days, right? My 7 clean days. But what if in the middle of that period, no pun intended, what if in the middle of that time span when I should be clean, so to speak, where I should not be bleeding, I end up bleeding again? Then,
so that's like a normal thing, though, for like
so it depends. These are questions that experts are asked all the time in the community that takes these things seriously. What constitutes a bleeding that's normal? What's just staining? What becomes a zab? What renders a person a zaba? This is a whole story. But anyway, we have this situation where you could become a zaba, and here's where we get a little bit of some of this distinguishing. Go ahead. If
during these 11 days she experiences a discharge on one day, or even on 2 consecutive days, she becomes a minor zava. To become tahor, pure, she must pass 1 day free of bloody discharge. She immerses herself in a mikvah, even on that clean day, and she becomes tahor if there is no recurrence of discharge before nightfall. That's according to Rashi. The minor zava is also called a woman who watches a day free of discharge, corresponding to a day or 2 of discharge. This is in contrast to the zava who experiences a discharge on 3 consecutive days, a major zava who must count 7 clean days before immersion in a mikvah can render her tahor.
Okay, so this is the simplest distinction. If the bleeding resumes and is consistent for 3 days, then you become a zaba. You shouldn't have been bleeding during this period, such a heavy bleeding, and you are, so you're considered a zaba. But if you only had a little bit of bleeding, then as long as you can then count a day of cleanness, after the day that you saw the blood, then you become ritually pure again. So here we have a situation where the zabaktana does not have to count 7 days, but if she sees one and she's the same ritual impurity, it just gets removed quicker and easier, and the other ritual impurity has to require 7 clean days. Go ahead. Back to the text, the Gemara.
That's the end of note 1.
So start from the paragraph again. The case of
the woman who watches a day corresponding to a day demonstrates that the 2 laws are not interdependent. For she conveys tuma to her couch and seat, yet she does not require the counting of 7 clean days to become tahor. So too, you should not be surprised about this zav who experienced 2 emissions, that even though he conveys tuma to his couch and seat, he does not require the counting of 7 clean days. Thus, in the absence of an explicit source, we would not include a zav of 2 emissions in the requirement to count 7 clean days. Therefore, the Torah states regarding the 7 clean days of Azav, from his emission he shall count 7 clean days, which implies that even one who seeks to be cleansed from a partial emission, that is, only 2 emissions, he shall count the 7 clean days. This teaches about Azav who experiences even 2 emissions, that he requires a counting of 7 clean days.
Okay. So again, I want to reiterate, this is a kind of a secondary operation that's being performed by the Gemara. We have these laws, and now we want to find ways to tie them into the biblical text. The laws are there already. The laws are known and accepted, but the Gemara wants to make some kind of connection, some kind of sense of wholeness between the written Torah and the oral Torah. And the way they do it is by developing all of these different ways of chopping and dicing and slicing the words of the Torah to be able to signify, oh, you see that little peculiarity, you see that little thing. That's where we can hook on to the Torah itself, the laws that we have. To use an image that comes to mind right now, if we think about all the laws as the puppies, let's say the mother has a big litter, right? All the puppies get hungry. The puppies want to be connected to the mother. So the puppies will scramble over each other until they can find where they can suckle from. So this is the rabbi's job. The rabbi's job is to take all of these laws that are out there, that are floating around, and they sort of bring the puppies to the right place in mama's body, where they can then be connected back to mom. So that's what they're doing. Okay. We're going right along. We might do this good. Gemara asks.
The Gemara asks, Rav Papa said to Abaya, what is different about this expression from his emission in the verse regarding 7 clean days, that it is construed to include a Zav who experiences 2 emissions in the requirement to count 7 clean days? And what is different about this expression from his emission in the verse regarding a Zav's requirement to bring an offering? That is, it is construed to exclude a Zav who experiences 2 emissions from the obligation to bring an offering.
Okay, so now this is pushing back, and Rav Papa says, but there needs to be some kind of consistency. We can't just play fast and loose so much, so blatantly. We're taking the word mizovo, and sometimes we use it to include things, and sometimes we use it to exclude things. So based on what? What are we doing here? Here, the same mizovo. In the case of ritual purification, we then say, okay, so that means that it includes the person who sees 2 emissions, that he has to count 7 days. So we're adding an obligation that doesn't say so explicitly in the Torah. Then when we're talking about sacrifices, the Torah says here, Zav has to bring a sacrifice. And then we go, oh, no, mizovo, that limits it. No, the sacrifice is not for all the Zavs, only for this Zav with the 3 experiences, but not with the 2. So we're using the same peculiarity of mizovo. In the one hand, we're adding. In the other hand, we're subtracting. Come on, let's be honest. It sounds a little too arbitrary. So what does Abaye say? The Gemara answers.
The Gemara answers. Abaye replied to Rav Papa, if you were to assume that this expression from his emission in the context of the 7 clean days comes to exclude a Zav who experienced only 2 emissions from counting the 7 clean days rather than to include him, then let the verse simply remain silent from it. Had the verse not mentioned from his emission altogether, we would have no reason to include a Zav who experienced only 2 emissions in the requirement to count 7 days.
Okay.
Abaye
so Abaye says, no, there is a contextual way of understanding this. It's not simply just this micro picking out of things for our own convenience, right? No, there's a logic to it also, and there's a way of contextually understanding the text. So that's the idea of contextual is one thing. The other thing is he's saying the Torah is planting these seeds for us. If the Torah didn't want us to have this deduction, the Torah wouldn't have put in this peculiarity for us to notice. Right? The Torah could have said it out. Now, of course, none of these assumptions are shared by quote unquote normal readers of the Torah. Right? Anybody that reads the text as simply saying, here's a text and I want to read it and understand it the best that I can, would never make these assumptions. This is a religiously based assumption. It's an assumption that sees behind the text of the Torah a mind with a capital M, right? A divine mind that is very, very conscious of how the text is put together, right? All of our, modern scholarship, it goes in the opposite way. Right? It says that the peculiarities of the text are the result of historical accidents. This person wrote this way, this person wrote that way. They didn't want to touch anything, so they left it alone. That's why there are contradictions. That's why there are inconsistencies and so on. But the rabbinic assumption is the exact opposite. It's all coherent, and it's coherent because it comes from a great mind, capital G, capital M. Therefore, any feature of this text is knowingly there and is waiting for its exposition. The famous text, the famous story that we've seen more than once, with all of its very, very profound implications for rabbinic Judaism, is the text of Moses coming up to get the Torah at Mount Sinai, right? The story that the rabbis tell. Moses comes up to Mount Sinai to get the Torah. Of course, God already appeared to the entire Jewish people, gave them the 10 Commandments with fire and thunder and lightning. And then the children of Israel say, no, Moses, you go get it. We've had enough, right? It's enough. But you're the starker, you go up, you get it. So Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. He disappears in the cloud. And the story is then told that he's ready to take the Torah. He's been taught the entire Torah. God gives it to him all the 40 days and 40 nights. And then Moses is waiting and God is busy. And what is God busy doing? Decorating the letters of certain letters of the Torah. God is decorating them with little crowns. So if you look in a Torah scroll that we have today, there are certain letters. Shatnez Gez is the letters that have crowns on them. So Moses says, I'm ready to go down. We did it. We're finished. I got the whole Torah. Thank you. Give me the Torah and I'll bring it down. And God says, I'm busy. I have to put these crowns on. Just give me another couple of minutes. I have to still scratch in, these little curlicues, these little extra things. And Moses says, why? And God says, because there will come a rabbi in the future who will be able to derive so many laws out of these little peculiarities. And Moses goes, really? Who is that? And God says it's somebody that 1,000 and 2,000 years later, whatever. Rabbi Akiva, more than 1,000 years later. So Moses says, whoa, let me see this guy. This is very impressive. So he gets in the time machine. He gets sent to Rabbi Akiva's class, and he sits in the back so nobody should see him. And he hears Rabbi Akiva teaching Torah, and he doesn't understand a word. He doesn't understand a word, and he feels completely bereft. Chalsha dato. He says, oh my God, I can't understand this. What happened to the Torah? And then he hears one of the students ask Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi, how do you know? What's the source for this teaching that you just gave us? And Rabbi Akiva says, it comes straight from Moses. Comes straight from Moses on Sinai. And then Moses goes, wow. So what I gave will unfold forever in ways that I don't own. I don't control this, but it's rooted in these little peculiarities if we notice them. So this is God saying, I'm planting the seeds. I'm putting in the peculiarities. It will then be up to the rabbis to squeeze out of these peculiarities, to notice the peculiarity and then to say what this peculiarity actually signifies. That's going to be their job. I'm putting it in there to make it possible for them, right? So, like Santa putting the gift under the tree, right? It's still up to us to open the box and then to use the gift. So this is the conviction of the rabbinic community that if it wasn't, necessary, it wouldn't be there, right? If we could figure this out on our own, we wouldn't need it to be put there. If something is put there, it's signaling to us that we need to figure something out here. Okay, Abaye.
Abaye anticipates a possible question. And perhaps you will argue that had the verse not mentioned from his emission, it would be derived from logical derivation, that a zav of 2 emissions requires 7 clean days. Therefore, the expression from his emission is needed to exclude him from this obligation. This is not a valid argument, because the case of a woman who watches a day corresponding to a day demonstrates that the 2 laws are not interdependent, as explained by the Baraita at the top of the column of the Amud.
Okay, so that's what we had before, right? We would think that maybe we would be able to figure it out ourselves. No, we would see that this is actually not logically necessary, and therefore we couldn't do it. Okay, and we're gonna finish the rest of this Gemara today. One more, Abaye.
Abaye anticipates another possible question. And perhaps you will argue that this expression from his emission in the verse is needed to teach from his emission and not from his emission and his tzara'at affliction. Accordingly, it is not extraneous that we should be forced to take it to include a zav of only 2 emissions in the requirement of 7 clean days. This is not a valid argument, because if so, that the verse means only to teach that a zav / mitzorah may count his 7 clean days while still a mitzorah, then let the verse write, and when the zav is cleansed and then remain silent. Why then do I need the extraneous expression from his emission? You must conclude that it teaches about a zav who experiences only 2 emissions, that he too requires the counting of 7 clean days to become tahor, as stated in the Baraita above.
Okay, so what Abaye has done is he's taken some of the other rules that we had before, and he's juggling them around and saying, we might have thought that without this, we would have known it anyway. No, if you start sorting out all of the different phrases and all of the different words with all the extra letters and so on, it ends up being that the only way that we get the system that we have at present is by allocating every single one of these verses to teach us each feature of the system. So we know, therefore, from one part that the zav gets ritually cleansed even though he's a mitzorah. We learn from the other part that the zav after 2 emissions has to count 2 clean days. We know that the zav with 3 has to bring the sacrifice. All of these things are now allocated to their proper place within the text. I want to bring out just one other little point, and that is when we look at it, we had it a couple of times. Abaye anticipates a possible question, right, on this paragraph, this column that we just read. And perhaps you will argue that had the verse not mentioned his emission, it would be derived from logical derivation. And we had on 8a, 8A4, that very short page, right? Questions the need for the scriptural source, but can it not be logically derived in the following way? So in each of these situations, the Gemara is saying, what do we need the text for? We can logically derive it ourselves. So I want to point out again a couple of things. Number one, well, or I'm going to ask you to point it out. What is the underlying assumption that the rabbis are seem to be making when they say that?
That logic is an important tool of analysis.
So yeah, logic is an important tool of analysis. I would say that they're saying something much stronger than that. They're saying something about logic. You're right. You know, the Greeks think that logic is important. The rabbis are living in a Greek world. They also agree that logic is important. But they're making a religious claim here. Sylvia, you unmuted?
Well,
Good.
Yeah, I think I am. Basically, that mankind has the ability to interpret. We don't need to have it necessarily written out. That the human being can interpret, and I'll go one step further, in light of where they are living, which makes it a very living Torah that can be interpreted in your own time based on your understanding and your use of logic based on circumstances.
Right. So yeah, this is, I want to nail that, very sharply. They're not just saying that logic is really a valuable tool, and they're saying logic equals Torah. Right? They're saying if I can figure out something by logic, I don't need the Torah to say it. Right? The Torah only comes to say what I wouldn't be able to figure out logically. And then, of course, I have to logically grapple with what the Torah is telling me and interpret, as Sylvia is saying. But what the Gemara says in both of these cases, can I figure this logically? And then Abaye says, perhaps you will argue that the verse, had the verse not mentioned it, it would still be okay. We would derive it logically. What do we need the verse for? We can figure it out ourselves. So a simple answer to this would be, what do you mean you could figure it out yourselves? Figuring it out yourselves is very nice, but if God tells you, it's different than if you figure it out yourself. What's assumed here is that that's not a distinction. If I can figure it out myself, it's just as good as if God told me. Right? That's a pretty strong statement to make. Jen. No, unmute.
That kind of implies that, though, anybody who doesn't reach this by logic, their logic must be faulty. And, down the road, some rabbis are going to have a lot of conflict with, say, Spinoza, and other people who have, forms of logic that don't actually match up to this. So it's kind of like it's dissing anyone who doesn't reach the same conclusions as they do. It's like, then your logic must be flawed because the Torah is completely logical. I see that as a little problematic.
A little problematic. I think we could just, even if we don't know anything about Spinoza, which I don't, I try, but I still can't figure him out.
One substance, we're all modes.
That's it. Right. But the problem even exists in what we were just talking about in unpacking the rabbinic assumptions of how they're reading the Torah, right? Because if the Torah is this supercharged text with divine thinking in it, right? So that each piece is put in there through God's intent of packing in, unfolding meanings that will come up. Then we're saying, what do I need the verse for if I could figure it out myself? Right? There's a clash right there already. And I think that that's the clash, for the rabbis. Sometimes the contradiction is its own solution. Right? That's part of the answer is the operation of our logic is circumscribed within a field that is identified as the divine will. That's where Spinoza goes out. Right? Spinoza says, I don't need the Torah at all to discern the divine will. In fact, the Torah is just a document about political use of power for a particular ethnic group, and we're past that. And what the rabbis are saying is, no, we start with the Torah. We start with the fact that the Torah is God's gift to us, and with an emphasis on God. But that gift, like I said, is then for us to unpack. And the unpacking then brings into question how much if God gives us a Lego set, does God have to make the Lego pieces be, the tractor or the castle or something? God gives us the Lego set and then we're supposed to do it. If we could figure out how to make the castle, God wouldn't make the castle. So no, but God then says, no, I want you to know this, that, and the other thing, because that you wouldn't know on your own. But now, once I showed you that, now Gesundheit, now go start thinking. So there is a dialectical relationship between these two poles. The human logic has a certain sovereign standing, but in service to God and in service to God's will as expressed in a certain way, right? It's not that therefore each of us,
Actually, Spinoza would not disagree with that, just with our degree of freedom.
He wouldn't?
No, he's all about God, but God is,
No, but yes, but God is not going to be limited for Spinoza to this, to right. The expression in this text.
And we are rabbis, limited in our freedom, except insofar as we can get close to God, right?
Right. So that's the big outrage. That's the big outrage with Spinoza. Again, with apologies to anybody who actually really knows anything about Spinoza. So yeah, Sylvia.
Leaving Spinoza to the side for the moment, going right back to the Talmud, if he's discussing logic, the logical assumption is that, okay, Rabbi A, B, and C, you've come to this conclusion, but my conclusion is different.
Right. So that's true also. When and what Jen was saying, if you don't agree with me, you must have faulty logic. Comes a point where the rabbis can throw this at each other, right? The rabbis will disagree about certain things, and certain things that make sense to Shammai don't make sense to Hillel, and certain things that make sense to Hillel don't make sense to Shammai, and down through the ages. So yeah, and
don't we have a very similar situation today among Jewish, the different versions of Judaism that float around today?
That's a good question. If you ask the Orthodox community, overwhelmingly they'll say, no, we are too much like Spinoza. We walked out of the game. We had changed the rules of the game so much that we don't count anymore. This is something that I spent many years trying to work on, this idea of pluralism and finding roots in the Jewish tradition for pluralism, and the fact that there's a Hillel camp and a Shammai camp, and they don't read each other out as heretics, which was the way that everybody else operated, right? And it still has it's still a big question. When is an argument too far? When does the argument get so hard that it goes out, the two arguers can no longer find the common ground together. To a certain extent, that's what we're struggling with in our country today. When you have people who are seriously thinking that maybe our country is going to split apart, that's what they're saying. What they're saying is that the old days when we used to have bipartisanship, when Republicans and Democrats could totally disagree with each other and yet work together because there was some common sense of unity. And then today, when people are bemoaning, is that really so anymore? Have we lost it? Is it retrievable? And I don't know. But they're talking about a historical process that's not so much a lot. The logic comes afterwards, but there is a sense in the end. Are you in? And we're having an argument together. Are we both participating in some common realm of discourse and values, or are you completely, out of what our thinking and you see me the same way? The Orthodox community is devoted to seeing itself as the exclusive determiner of the parameters of logic and the parameters of ideas about Judaism. And therefore, we are not an alternative, another view. We are, the word that used to be used is, we are the deviationists. We are the deviants. And they refuse to acknowledge the possibility that we have just another point of view. And they brush that aside. Every argument that's been going on for generations already. Every argument that we bring up that says, look at all the pluralism that's been involved in the Jewish tradition over the centuries and the millennia, in fact. And they go, no, but you guys are out of it because you don't really accept the same things that we do. Yeah, Jen.
Does it seem to anyone else that this is in large part how we interpret our culture? Because I feel like I've read Orthodox rabbis, one in particular, and I can't remember, but I have the book so I can look it up, who talked about, when he died, it just meant that God would be finished playing with him playing his part as Rabbi so-and-so any longer, which is like full out monism, pantheism, which is what Spinoza espouses. So, I mean, if you can have completely monistic, pantheistic views in Judaism, then that's not the problem. The logic that we're each seeing and the way is not the issue. So it seems to me like the issue is much more on very concrete levels of how we express ourselves as Jews. So big picture stuff is in Judaism weirdly not important. But when you go to shul or how you dress and, how you express day-to-day Judaism seems to be our big sticking points.
Right.
It's just, which I find interesting, completely interesting, because it's in many ways the opposite in the religion I came from, where God forbid you get any big picture stuff wrong. Whereas here, it's if Spinoza had had his big picture stuff, but gone to shul regularly and done everything he was supposed to do, everybody would have been fine with him.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Right. Right. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. I think we're going to leave it there for now. And it goes in circles a little bit, but we're not going to keep on circling for today. I want to just bring next time, before we go into the next Mishnah, if somebody miraculously will remember this, I want to just say one more thing about the term in the Aramaic or in the Hebrew for logical deduction. I want to talk about that for a second, and then we'll go on to the next Mishnah, which is going to be about, guess what? The leper. So another very relevant and common experience that all of us will be able to relate to. Okay, so hopefully see you guys next year, yes, in 2021. Okay, Zygazint, everybody.
Happy New Year, Zygazint.